Chapter 1. The Christmas Gathering. Snow fell gently over the village of St. Mary Mead, coating the thatched roofs and stone cottages in a pristine white blanket. The village green, usually the scene of summer fetes and cricket matches, now lay, hushed beneath the December sky. Christmas lights twinkled in cottage windows, and wreaths adorned nearly every door along the high street. It was, by all accounts, the most peaceful time of the year in this most peaceful of English villages. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her nimble fingers working at her knitting, as she observed the comings and goings outside her cottage. 75, with her soft white hair and gentle blue eyes, she appeared to be nothing more than a sweet, somewhat gossipy, elderly lady. The villagers of St. Mary Mead knew better, of course. Those innocent-looking eyes had seen through many a deception over the years, and her understanding of human nature had helped solve crimes that had baffled even Scotland Yard's finest. "Now, that's interesting," she murmured to herself as she watched Colonel Prothero's motor car pass by for the third time that morning. The Colonel, a notorious stickler for routine, rarely ventured out before noon on Saturdays. Miss Marple made a mental note of this unusual behaviour, not because she expected it to be significant, but because she had long ago formed the habit of observing even the smallest deviations from normal patterns. Her telephone rang, interrupting her observations. "Miss Marple, it's Dolly Bantry here." "Good morning, Dolly. What a lovely surprise. I'm calling about tonight's dinner party. I do hope you're still able to come. The weather isn't keeping you in, is it?" "Not at all, dear. I wouldn't miss Mrs. Blacklock's Christmas gathering for the world." "Splendid. Arthur and I will collect you at 6 then." After replacing the receiver, Miss Marple returned to her window seat. Mrs. Letitia Blacklock's annual Christmas dinner was something of an institution in St. Mary Mead. As the owner of Little Paddocks, the most impressive house in the village after Gossington Hall, Mrs. Blacklock took pride in bringing together the various social circles that might otherwise never intermingle. Doctors and solicitors would dine alongside shopkeepers and the vicar, creating what Mrs. Blacklock called a true village gathering. This year's dinner held particular interest because Mrs. Blacklock had invited her recently discovered distant cousin, Patrick Simmons, and his sister Julia, who had moved into Little Paddocks just 2 months prior. The pair had caused quite a stir in the village, Patrick with his charming manner that set the hearts of young women fluttering, and Julia with her fashionable London clothes and somewhat bohemian attitudes. As evening approached, Miss Marple, dressed with her customary care in a black dress with lace at the collar and cuffs, she added her favourite brooch, a small silver bird that had been a gift from her nephew Raymond, and surveyed herself in the mirror with a critical eye. "You look perfectly acceptable for an old lady," she told her reflection with a small smile. At precisely 6 o'clock, Colonel Bantry's Daimler pulled up outside her gate. The Colonel, a ruddy-faced man with an impressive white moustache, hurried through the snow to escort her to the car, where Mrs. Bantry waited, elegant in a dark green evening dress. "Everyone will be there tonight," Mrs. Bantry confided as they drove through the village. "Dr. Haydock, of course, and that new doctor. What's his name? Simons, and the Harmons from the vicarage. Oh, and Mrs. Blacklock's companion, that poor Dora Bunner. How she puts up with that woman's fussing, I'll never know." Colonel Bantry chuckled. "Now, Dolly, Miss Bunner is devoted to Letitia. been friends since school days, haven't they, Miss Marple?" "Indeed," Miss Marple said mildly. "Some friendships endure despite the most trying circumstances." Little paddocks blazed with light as they approached. The Georgian house stood back from the road, its large windows glowing invitingly against the dark winter night. Inside, the hall was festooned with holly and ivy, and a massive Christmas tree dominated one corner of the drawing-room, its ornaments catching the light from the fireplace. Mrs. Blacklock herself greeted them at the door, a tall, confident woman in her 60s, wearing a deep burgundy dress that complemented her silver hair. Behind her hovered Miss Bunner, small and bird-like, her faded blue eyes anxious as she checked that everything was in order. "Jane, how lovely to see you," Mrs. Blacklock said warmly. "And Dolly Arthur, come in, come in. It's frightfully cold out there." The drawing-room was already half full. Miss Marple recognised Dr. Haydock, the elderly village doctor with whom she shared a gardening interest. Young Dr. Simmons, newly arrived from London, and the Reverend Julian Harmon with his vivacious wife Bunch. Standing by the fireplace, holding, caught among a group of younger guests, was Patrick Simmons, handsome in a dinner jacket that emphasised his broad shoulders. His sister Julia stood nearby, striking in a modern gown of midnight blue that caused Mrs. Harmon's more modest attire to look decidedly provincial. "Sherry, Miss Marple." Miss Bunner appeared at her elbow with a tray of glasses. "Thank you, Dora. How lovely everything looks." "Oh, it's all Letitia's doing," Miss Bunner said with a nervous laugh. "I just fuss about in the background, though I did make the plum pudding, my mother's recipe, you know. Letitia insists on having it every year." As she spoke, the doorbell rang again, and Miss Bunner hurried off to assist with the new arrivals. Miss Marple sipped her sherry and observed the room with quiet interest. She noted how Dr. Simmons's eyes followed Julia Simmons, and how Mrs. Blacklock's hand trembled slightly when Colonel Prothero addressed her. Most intriguing of all was the way Patrick Simmons occasionally glanced toward the door, as if expecting or perhaps dreading a particular arrival. Little did Miss Marple know that before the evening was over, her powers of observation would be called upon for far more serious matters than village romance. For among the collection of seemingly ordinary people gathered in that festive room, someone harboured deadly intentions, and Mrs. Blacklock's famous plum pudding would soon earn a more sinister reputation than anyone could have imagined. Chapter 2. A deadly dessert dinner at Little Paddock's progressed with all the ceremonial splendour that Mrs. Blacklock could muster. The long mahogany table gleamed under candlelight, and the finest china and silver had been brought out for the occasion. Conversation flowed as freely as the wine, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter, particularly whenever Patrick Simmons delivered one of his amusing London anecdotes. Miss Marple, seated between Colonel Bantry and Dr. Haydock, ate with quiet appreciation while her observant eyes missed nothing. She noted how Miss Bunner hovered anxiously behind Mrs. Blacklock's chair, occasionally whispering urgent comments about the food service. She observed the tight smile that Julia Simmons wore whenever her brother commanded attention, and the way young Dr. Simmons kept refilling Mrs. Blacklock's wine-glass with particular attentiveness. "Quite a gathering Letitia's managed this year," Colonel Bantry remarked to Miss Marple as they finished their roast goose. "Though I must say there seems to be some tension in the air. People are often tense at Christmas gatherings, Miss Marple replied mildly. "So many expectations, you know, and families can be complicated." "The Simmons pair don't seem very close for siblings," the Colonel observed in a low voice. "Reminds me of the Freebody case. You remember that business, Miss Marple?" "Indeed, most illuminating about the nature of family relationships." Dr. Haydock leaned in from her other side. "Are you two gossiping again? Really, Jane, I thought better of you." His eyes twinkled as he spoke, and Miss Marple smiled at her old friend. "Not gossiping, Doctor. Merely observing human nature, which I find endlessly fascinating." "As do I," he agreed, "though in my profession I tend to observe its physical manifestations. Speaking of which, our hostess doesn't look well tonight." Miss Marple glanced at Mrs. Blacklock, who did indeed appear paler than usual, with a slight sheen of perspiration on her forehead, despite the winter chill. "Perhaps it's the exertion of hosting," she suggested, though her eyes narrowed thoughtfully. The climax of the meal arrived when Miss Bunner proudly carried in an enormous plum pudding, aflame with brandy and decorated with a sprig of holly. "Special recipe," she announced with uncharacteristic confidence. "Letitia insists I make it every year, though I've made a few changes this time. I do hope everyone will try it." Mrs. Blacklock smiled tightly. "Dora has been making this pudding for 15 years, and it improves annually, though I wasn't aware of any changes to the recipe." Miss Bunner flushed. "Just a small adjustment, Letitia. Nothing significant." The pudding was served amid appreciative murmurs, with Miss Bunner hovering anxiously as each guest took a portion. Miss Marple couldn't help noticing that the companion seemed particularly concerned about which plate went to whom. "Are you not having any, Miss Bunner?" Miss Marple inquired. "Oh, well, I prefer to see everyone else enjoy it first," Miss Bunner stammered, clutching her hands together. "And I'm watching my figure, you know." "Nonsense, Dora," called Mrs. Blacklock. "You've been talking about this pudding for weeks. Patrick, give Dora a serving, would you?" Patrick Simmons, who had been engaged in quiet conversation with Dr. Simmons, looked up with a start. "Of course," he said, though Miss Marple detected a flicker of something, concern, alarm, in his eyes. As Miss Bunner reluctantly took a seat and accepted a small portion of pudding, conversation resumed around the table. Mrs. Bantry was telling a story about her gardener's peculiar habits when a sharp clatter of silverware against china silenced the room. Mrs. Blacklock had dropped her spoon. Her face had turned an alarming shade of grey, and she clutched at her throat. "Letitia!" Miss Bunner half rose from her chair, her face a mask of horror. "Are you all right?" Mrs. Blacklock tried to speak, but could only produce a strangled gasp. Her eyes bulged as she struggled to breathe, and she knocked over her water-glass in a desperate grab for the table edge. "Good God!" exclaimed Colonel Bantry. "The woman's choking!" Dr. Haydock was on his feet instantly, moving with surprising agility for his age. Dr. Simmons, too, rushed to Mrs. Blacklock's side, but before either could reach her, she slumped forward, onto the table, her body convulsing violently. "Everyone back!" Dr. Haydock commanded. "Give her air!" The guests scattered in confusion as the two doctors worked over the stricken woman. Miss Bunner stood frozen, her hands pressed against her mouth, emitting small whimpering sounds. "Is it her heart?" Julia Simmons asked, her usual composure shattered. "I don't think so," Dr. Simmons replied grimly. He looked up at the assembled guests. Has anyone else experienced any symptoms? Difficulty breathing, tingling, nausea?" There was a general murmur of denial, though several guests now regarded their pudding plates with sudden suspicion. "I think we should call for an ambulance," Dr. Haydock said quietly to Mrs. Bantry, who nodded and hurried from the room. Miss Marple had not joined the crowd around Mrs. Blacklock. Instead, she watched the reactions of those present. Patrick Simmons stood slightly apart, his handsome face taut with an expression that might have been shock, or something else entirely. Julia had moved to stand near the doorway, as if calculating an escape route. And Miss Bunner, poor, anxious Miss Bunner, seemed genuinely distraught, yet there was something in her manner that struck Miss Marple as peculiar. "It's the pudding," Miss Bunner suddenly wailed. "It must be. But how could that be? I made it myself, just as I always do." "Miss Bunner," Miss Marple said softly, approaching the distressed woman. "Did anyone else have access to the pudding before it was served?" Before Miss Bunner could answer, Mrs. Blacklock gave a final terrible gasp. Dr. Haydock looked up, his face grave, and shook his head. "I'm afraid she's gone," he announced to the stunned gathering, "and judging by the symptoms, I very much doubt it was natural causes." A horrified silence fell over the room, broken only by Miss Bunner's quiet sobbing. Colonel Bantry, ever practical, moved to the telephone in the hall. "I'll call Inspector Craddock," he said grimly. "This is a matter for the police now." As the evening dissolved into chaos, with guests milling about in shock and the doctors examining the remains of the plum pudding, Miss Marple sat quietly in a corner, her knitting needles now still in her lap. Her mind, however, was far from idle. Already, certain curious details had caught her attention. Small inconsistencies and peculiar behaviours that might mean nothing, or everything. The poisoner, she suspected, was still among them, and whoever it was had made a critical mistake, one that reminded her of something she had once observed in the village many years ago, a pattern of human behaviour that would eventually lead her to the truth. Chapter 3. The Inspector Arrives. The transformation of Little Paddocks from festive gathering to crime scene occurred with remarkable swiftness. Within an hour of Colonel Bantry's telephone call, Inspector Craddock had arrived with 2 constables and a police surgeon, though the latter confirmed what Doctors Haydock and Simons had already determined. Mrs. Blacklock had died from what appeared to be some form of poison. "We'll need to analyse the remains of the pudding," Inspector Craddock said, surveying the dining room where the dishes remained untouched since the tragedy. He was a lean, intelligent-looking man in his 40s, with shrewd eyes that missed little. "And I'm afraid everyone will need to remain here until I've taken preliminary statements." The guests had been ushered into the drawing-room, where they sat in awkward silence. Miss Bunner had been given a sedative by Dr. Haydock, and now dozed fitfully on a sofa, occasionally waking with a start and crying out for Letitia before drifting off again. "It's absolutely monstrous," Mrs. Bantry whispered to Miss Marple, who sat quietly in a corner, her knitting once again in her hands. "Poor Letitia! Who would want to poison her?" "That is indeed the question," Miss Marple replied, "though it may be worth considering whether Mrs. Blacklock was actually the intended victim." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "You think someone else was the target, but everyone ate the pudding?" "Not quite everyone," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes on Miss Bunner. And there did seem to be some confusion about which serving went where. Before Mrs. Bantry could respond, Inspector Craddock entered the room. He cast his experienced eye over the assembled guests before addressing them. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'll be interviewing each of you individually in the study. In the meantime, I must ask that you refrain from discussing the events of this evening among yourselves. Constable Hayes will remain here with you." He consulted a list. "I'll begin with Miss Dora Bunner, as she prepared the pudding." "She's sedated," Dr. Haydock said, rising from his chair. "I wouldn't recommend questioning her tonight, Inspector." "Very well. Mr. Patrick Simmons, then." Patrick straightened his dinner jacket as he stood. "Of course, Inspector." His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noticed a slight tremor in his hands. As Patrick followed the inspector from the room, the remaining guests settled into an uncomfortable silence, punctuated only by Miss Bunner's occasional murmurs. Colonel Bantry paced by the window, while his wife twisted her handkerchief into knots. The vicar and his wife sat together, Mrs. Harmon's usual vivacity subdued into shocked stillness. Julia Simmons lit a cigarette, her elegant fingers surprisingly steady. "This is absurd," she said suddenly. "We're all sitting here like suspects in a bad detective novel." "We are suspects, Miss Simmons," Dr. Simons replied softly. "Someone in this house poisoned that pudding." "Not necessarily," Colonel Bantry countered. "It could have been tampered with earlier, or perhaps the poison was in something else entirely. Dr. Haydock?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle but penetrating. "What were Mrs. Blacklock's symptoms exactly?" The old doctor looked at her thoughtfully. "Rapid onset of respiratory distress, muscular paralysis, dilated pupils, classic signs of certain alkaloid poisons, possibly aconite or one of the more potent botanical toxins." "Something that would act quickly, then," Miss Marple mused, "and would need to be administered shortly before consumption." Dr. Haydock nodded. "It would seem so. But that means—" Mrs. Bantry began, then stopped as Patrick Simmons returned to the room, his face inscrutable. "Miss Julia Simmons," the constable called. "The inspector would like to see you now." As Julia stubbed out her cigarette and followed the constable, Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. To the casual observer, she appeared to be a slightly distracted elderly lady, more concerned with her knitting than the drama unfolding around her. But beneath her placid exterior, her mind was methodically sorting through the events of the evening, comparing behaviours, noting inconsistencies. One by one, the guests were called to the study and returned looking variously shaken, defensive, or merely tired. Miss Marple observed each one's demeanour upon return with particular interest. When Dr. Simmons came back, he immediately poured himself a whisky, his hand less steady than before. The vicar seemed withdrawn after his interview, while Mrs. Harmon appeared close to tears. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, interviewed together as old friends of the deceased, returned looking grave but composed. Finally, the constable approached Miss Marple. "The inspector would like to speak with you now, miss." Miss Marple carefully placed her knitting in her bag and followed him to the study, where Inspector Craddock stood by the fireplace, studying a notebook. "Miss Marple," he said, looking up, "please take a seat. I understand from Colonel Bantry that you have some experience with this sort of situation." Miss Marple smiled modestly. "I wouldn't say that, Inspector. I've merely had occasion to observe human nature in my little village. People are remarkably similar everywhere, you know, so I've heard. The inspector's tone was respectful but pragmatic. Now, tell me what you observed this evening, particularly anything unusual or out of place. Well, Miss Marple began, smoothing her skirt, I noticed several curious things. Miss Bunner seemed extraordinarily anxious about the pudding, more so than would be natural even for someone of her nervous disposition. And she was very particular about who received which serving. Go on. Then there was Mrs. Blacklock herself. She'd been looking unwell even before dinner, perspiring when the room wasn't particularly warm, and her hands were trembling. Dr. Haydock noticed it too. The inspector made a note. Possibly early symptoms? Perhaps. Also, Patrick Simmons kept watching the door throughout dinner, as if expecting someone, and when Miss Bunner mentioned changing the recipe, Mrs. Blacklock seemed surprised. One might almost say alarmed. "You have a sharp eye, Miss Marple," Inspector Craddock commented. "In a small village, observation becomes a habit," she replied. "One couldn't help noticing, for instance, that Julia and Patrick Simmons don't behave quite like siblings normally do." "How so?" "They rarely look at each other when speaking, and there's no familiarity in their manner. It reminds me of the Thompson sisters in St. Mary Mead, who weren't sisters at all, but distant cousins using the relationship as a convenient explanation for their living arrangement." As Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, outside in the drawing-room, a sudden commotion erupted. There was a crash, followed by Miss Bunner's voice rising in hysteria. "I didn't do it! I would never harm Letitia! It wasn't me!" The inspector rushed from the study with Miss Marple, following more sedately. In the drawing-room, Miss Bunner stood, swaying, having apparently woken from her sedated state. Dr. Haydock was attempting to calm her, but she pushed him away. "She was my dearest friend," Miss Bunner sobbed. "But she changed the will last week. She changed it." Then her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed into Dr. Haydock's arms. As the doctor lowered her to the sofa, Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock exchanged a meaningful glance. The case had just become considerably more complicated, and yet, for Miss Marple, a pattern was beginning to emerge from the chaos, a pattern as familiar to her as the stitches in her knitting. Chapter 4. Wills and Whispers. By morning, the news of Mrs. Blacklock's death had spread throughout St. Mary Mead like frost across a window-pane. The village, which had been preparing for Christmas festivities, now buzzed with speculation and whispered theories. The fact that Inspector Craddock had kept all the dinner guests at Little Paddocks overnight only fueled the rumours. Miss Marple, after a surprisingly sound sleep in one of the guest bedrooms, made her way downstairs to find the inspector, in conversation with Dr. Haydock in the morning-room. The rest of the house was quiet. The other guests were presumably still in their rooms, or speaking with the constables. "Ah, Miss Marple," Inspector Craddock said, looking up from his notebook. "Dr. Haydock has just confirmed his preliminary assessment. Poison, almost certainly aconite, monkshood, as it's commonly known." "From the garden, perhaps?" Miss Marple suggested, settling herself in a chair by the window. Dr. Haydock nodded. It grows wild in some parts, though it's also cultivated in gardens. The roots contain the highest concentration of the toxin." "We've had Constable Hayes checking the garden," the inspector added. "There's a rather overgrown section at the far end with several suspicious plants, But the question remains, who put it in the pudding? And was Mrs. Blacklock the intended victim? Miss Marple's needles appeared in her hands, though her attention remained on the conversation. Miss Bunner's comment about the will was most interesting, she remarked. Have you had an opportunity to verify it, Inspector? I've telephoned Mrs. Blacklock's solicitor, Mr. Bedingfeld. He's coming later this morning with the document. Inspector Craddock tapped his pencil against his notebook. Miss Bunner is still quite distraught, though more coherent this morning. She insists she had nothing to do with the poisoning, but confirms that Mrs. Blacklock did indeed change her will a week ago. Most illuminating, Miss Marple murmured. And how is everyone else this morning? The Bantrys have gone home to Gossington Hall, though I've asked them to remain available. The vicar and his wife likewise. The Simmons siblings and Dr. Simmonds are still here, as is Miss Bunner, of course. The inspector lowered his voice. Between ourselves, I'm particularly interested in Patrick Simmons. His story about how he and his sister came to live with Mrs. Blacklock seems incomplete. Before Miss Marple could respond, the door opened and Julia Simmons entered. She had changed from her evening dress into a simple tweed skirt and cashmere sweater, but she still managed to look elegantly out of place in the country setting. "Good morning," she said, her composure apparently recovered. "I understand we're still not permitted to leave?" "Not just yet, Miss Simmons," the inspector confirmed. "The police surgeon will need to see everyone once more, and I may have additional questions following my meeting with Mrs. Blacklock's solicitor." Julia raised one perfectly shaped eyebrow. "This is about the will, I suppose. Poor Dora was quite hysterical last night. She helped herself to tea from the pot on the sideboard. Though I can't imagine what relevance it has to what happened. Patrick and I have only been here 2 months. We could hardly have expectations about Cousin Letitia's estate." "And yet you are her relatives," the inspector noted. "Her only living relatives, I believe." "Very distant ones," Julia replied with a slight shrug. "Second cousins once removed, or some such complicated connection. We scarcely knew her before coming to stay." "At her invitation?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Julia gave her a measuring look. "Yes. She wrote to us after our parents died. The issue house in London was being sold, and we needed somewhere to live. Cousin Letitia offered us rooms here until we sorted ourselves out, as she put it. Most generous, Miss Marple commented. "Yes, though not entirely altruistic," Julia said with a touch of bitterness. "She liked having young people around. Said we reminded her of her younger days, and Patrick kept her amused with his stories. Yes." If summoned by the mention of his name, Patrick Simmons appeared in the doorway. He looked considerably less dashing than he had the previous evening, with shadows under his eyes and his dark hair dishevelled. "Morning," he said curtly. "Has there been any news?" "We were just discussing your cousin's will," Julia told him. "It seems to be of great interest to the police." Patrick's face tightened. "I don't see what that has to do with anything. As we told you last night, Inspector, we barely knew Cousin Letitia before coming here." "And yet you were living in her house," the inspector pointed out. "Miss Bunner seems to think the will was changed to your benefit." "Dora's confused," Patrick said dismissively. "She's been in a state ever since Cousin Letitia had that health scare last month. You know, when she thought she'd found a lump." Julia shot her brother a warning glance. "In any case," she said smoothly, Surely the more relevant question is who would want to poison her. Dora made that pudding, and from what I gather, she's the most likely beneficiary of the original will. They were friends for decades, unless someone tampered with the pudding after Miss Bunner prepared it, Miss Marple suggested. Her knitting needles paused as she looked thoughtfully at the siblings. Did either of you happen to notice anyone in the kitchen yesterday afternoon or evening? We were both out until it was time to dress for dinner, Patrick answered quickly. I was in the village and Julia was... I went for a walk, Julia supplied. The weather was clear for once, and I needed some air. Alone? Inspector Craddock inquired. Is that a crime now? Julia retorted. Yes, alone. I often walk alone. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Simmons. The young doctor looked considerably more composed than the previous evening, though he still carried an air of tension about him. Inspector, there's something I think you should know, he said without preamble. It concerns Mrs. Blacklock's health. Oh? The inspector straightened. His interest piqued. She consulted me last month about a suspicious mass she'd discovered. I examined her and sent her to a specialist in London. Dr. Simmons hesitated. The diagnosis was confirmed 2 weeks ago. Advanced carcinoma with a very poor prognosis. 6 months at most, possibly less. A silence fell over the room as this information sank in. I see, Inspector Craddock said finally. And who else knew about this diagnosis? Mrs. Blacklock asked. Me to keep it confidential, Dr. Simons replied. But she did say she needed to get her affairs in order. I assumed that meant updating her will. Did anyone else know? The inspector pressed. I believe she told Miss Bunner. They were very close, and she would have needed support. Beyond that, I couldn't say. Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady clicking. It does put rather a different complexion on things, she remarked. A dying woman changes her will, and within a week she's poisoned at her own dinner table. Before anyone could respond to this observation, a constable appeared to announce the arrival of Mr. Bedingfeld, the solicitor. As the inspector went to meet him, Miss Marple watched the reactions of the others in the room. Dr. Simmons looked uncomfortable, but relieved to have shared his information. Julia Simmons maintained her cool facade, though her fingers tapped restlessly against her teacup. And Patrick's expression was the most interesting of all, a curious mixture of apprehension and what Miss Marple could only describe as calculation. Miss Marple, he said, noticing her scrutiny, you were a friend of Cousin Letitia's, weren't you? Had you known her long? Not very long, she admitted. We met through our mutual interest in the hospital committee. But one can observe a great deal even in a short acquaintance. She smiled gently. For instance, I had noticed that despite her sometimes brusque manner, Mrs. Blacklock was fundamentally a kind woman, and one who valued honesty above all else. As she spoke these last words, Miss Marple's eyes met Patrick's, and for a moment something flickered in his expression, a recognition perhaps, or a warning. Whatever it was, it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Miss Marple with yet another piece to add to her slowly forming puzzle. Chapter 5. Secrets Revealed. The reading of Letitia Blacklock's will took place in the library, a room that reflected its owner's orderly mind with its neatly arranged bookshelves and absence of unnecessary ornaments. Inspector Craddock had assembled all the residents of Little Paddocks, along with Dr. Haydock as a representative of the Bantries, who had been permitted to return home, but had asked to be kept informed of developments. Mr. Bedingfeld, the solicitor, was a thin, precise man with gold-rimmed spectacles and a voice as dry as the legal documents he handled. He placed his briefcase on the mahogany desk and extracted 2 envelopes. "I have here," he announced, "2 wills made by the late Mrs. Blacklock. The first, dated March of last year, and the second, executed just 8 days ago." Miss Bunner, who had regained some composure but still looked fragile, twisted her handkerchief anxiously. Miss Marple, seated beside her, patted her hand reassuringly. "In the original will," Mr. Bedingfeld continued, "Mrs. Blacklock left the bulk of her estate, including this house and investments valued at approximately £70,000, to Miss Dora Bunner, with smaller bequests to various charities, and £5,000 each to Mr. Patrick and Miss Julia Simmons, should they still be in residence at the time of her death." There was a murmur of reaction around the room. Patrick's face remained carefully impassive, while Julia raised her eyebrows slightly. "The new will, however," the solicitor continued, adjusting his spectacles, "makes a significant change. While the charitable bequests remain the same, the house and £50,000 now go to Mr. Patrick and Miss Julia Simmons, with £20,000 to Miss Bunner, who also retains the right to reside at Little Paddocks for the remainder of her life." Miss Bunner gave a small gasp. "But I never expected. Letitia told me she was making a small adjustment." "Seems like rather more than a small adjustment," Inspector Craddock observed. "Can you think of any reason for such a substantial change, Miss Bunner?" "I can't imagine," Miss Bunner stammered. "We'd been friends since school days. She always said I would be taken care of." "And so you are," Julia Simmons pointed out coolly. £20,000 is hardly a pittance, and you still have a home here." "If I may continue," Mr. Bedingfeld interjected, "there is a letter that accompanies the new will addressed to Miss Bunner, which Mrs. Blacklock instructed me to read in the event of her death." He withdrew a single sheet of paper from the second envelope and began to read. "My dear Dora, if you are hearing this, then I have gone sooner than the doctors predicted. I know the changes to my will may come as a surprise to you, but please understand that they are made with careful consideration. Patrick and Julia represent the future of our family line, distant though the connection may be, and I have come to think of them as the children I never had. Your future is secure, my dear friend, and I hope you will come to see the wisdom in my decision. Remember our conversation about making the most of the time we have left. This is my way of doing so. With all my affection, Letitia." A heavy silence followed the reading. Miss Bunner dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief, while Patrick stared fixedly at the floor. "When was Mrs. Blacklock diagnosed with cancer?" Inspector Craddock asked abruptly. Mr. Bedingfeld looked startled. I understood from Mrs. Blacklock that she received the diagnosis 3 weeks ago. It was, in fact, the impetus for updating her will." "And you witnessed the signing?" "Indeed, along with my clerk. Everything was in perfect order, I assure you." "I'm sure it was, from a legal perspective," the inspector said. "But it does create a rather compelling motive for murder. Wouldn't you agree?" Dr. Simmons shifted uncomfortably. "But if Mrs. Blacklock was already dying—" 6 months is still 6, Months, Inspector Craddock pointed out, and there's quite a difference between inheriting now and inheriting after medical expenses and nursing care have depleted the estate. Miss Marple, who had been quietly knitting throughout this exchange, looked up. "Inspector, might I ask if there was any indication of when Mrs. Blacklock expected the Simmons siblings to leave Little Paddocks? In the letter, she refers to them being in residence at the time of her death. Was their stay intended to be temporary?" Mr. Bedingfeld consulted his notes. Mrs. Blacklock did mention that the arrangement was initially for 6 months, after which it would be reviewed. They have been here for just over 2 months, I believe. How convenient that the will was changed to benefit them before that review, Dr. Haydock remarked. Patrick stood abruptly. "This is outrageous. You're practically accusing us of murder." "One is being accused, Mr. Simmons," Inspector Craddock said calmly. "We are merely establishing facts." Julia placed a restraining hand on her brother's arm. "Patrick, sit down. The inspector is just doing his job." She turned to Craddock. "Yes, we stood to gain from Cousin Letitia's new will, but so did many people from her old one. If inheritance was the motive, why wasn't Dora poisoned instead?" "A fair question," the inspector acknowledged, "and one we're still investigating." Miss Bunner, who had been silent since the reading of the letter, suddenly spoke up. "Letitia wasn't like that," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all morning. "She wouldn't have changed her will because of money or convenience. If she left her estate to Patrick and Julia, she must have had a good reason." She looked appealingly at the siblings. "She must have seen something special in you both." An uncomfortable expression flitted across Patrick's face, but Julia smiled at Miss Bunner with unexpected warmth. "Thank you, Dora. I believe she did care for us in her way." "Mrs. Blacklock mentioned to me once that you reminded her of someone from her past," Miss Marple said conversationally. "A Charlotte, I believe she said." The effect of this seemingly innocent remark was electric. Patrick's face drained of colour, and even Julia's composure slipped momentarily. Miss Bunner looked bewildered. "Charlotte?" she repeated. "But that was—" She stopped abruptly, her eyes widening as she looked from Patrick to Julia and back again. "That will be all for now, Mr. Bedingfeld," Inspector Craddock said, his sharp eyes missing none of these reactions. "Thank you for your time." As the solicitor gathered his papers, Inspector Craddock announced that the house would remain under police supervision, but that the residents were now permitted to move about the village, provided they remained available for further questioning. "Miss Marple," he added, "might I have a word with you privately?" In the small morning room, away from the others, Inspector Craddock regarded Miss Marple with respectful curiosity. "That name you mentioned, Charlotte, it clearly meant something to our suspects, yet I noticed it wasn't in the will or the letter." Miss Marple smiled gently. "No, it wasn't, but when Mrs. Blacklock invited me to tea last month, she showed me some old photographs. There was one of her with a woman named Charlotte Blacklock, her sister, who died quite young. Mrs. Blacklock mentioned that Julia had her sister's eyes. I thought it an innocent observation at the time. But now I wonder if there might be more to the connection than mere resemblance," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "In my experience, Inspector, family histories are often more complicated than they first appear. Rather like the Ellsworth case in St. Mary Mead, where the supposed nephew turned out to be—" She stopped herself, but perhaps that's not relevant here. The inspector smiled faintly. "On the contrary, Miss Marple, I find your village parallels most illuminating." He consulted his notebook. "I'm having inquiries made about Patrick and Julia Simmons's background, and I've sent a constable to examine the garden more thoroughly for evidence of monkshood." "A sensible precaution," Miss Marple agreed, "though if I were looking for the source of the poison, I might also inquire at local chemists. Aconite has certain pharmaceutical applications, I believe." As they rejoined the others, they found the atmosphere in the library had shifted. Patrick was engaged in quiet, intense conversation with Julia by the window, while Miss Bunner sat alone, a curious expression on her face, part confusion, part dawning realization. Dr. Haydock approached Miss Marple. "I'm returning to the village," he said. "Might I offer you a lift home, Jane? You must be tired after all this excitement." "How kind, but I think I'll stay a little longer," Miss Marple replied. "Miss Bunner seems in need of company, and I believe we might continue our conversation about Mrs. Blacklock's garden. She had quite a remarkable collection of medicinal herbs, I understand." Dr. Haydock gave her a knowing look. "Always the botanist, aren't you, Jane? Very well, but don't overtax yourself." He lowered his voice. "And be careful. If someone in this house is a murderer, they may not appreciate your observations." Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled. "Oh, I'm just a harmless old lady with a fondness for gardening and gossip, Doctor. No one takes much notice of me." But as she settled herself, beside Miss Bunner, her knitting once again in her hands, Miss Marple's mind was far from idle. The mention of Charlotte Blacklock had yielded far more information than she had anticipated, and she now had a theory forming, one that might explain not only the changed will, but also the peculiar relationship between the Simmons siblings, and perhaps even the motive for murder. The only question was whether she could prove it before the killer struck again. Chapter 6. The Hidden Photograph. After the others had dispersed, Miss Marple remained at Little Paddocks with Miss Bunner, who seemed reluctant to be left alone with her thoughts. The two elderly ladies sat in the small sitting room that had been Miss Bunner's private retreat, a cosy space with faded chintz furniture and watercolour landscapes on the walls. "You've been very kind, Miss Marple," Miss Bunner said, pouring tea with hands that trembled only slightly. "This has all been so dreadful. I still can't believe Letitia is gone." "You were friends for a very long time, I understand," Miss Marple prompted gently. "Since our school days at Fallowfield. Over 50 years. Miss Bunner's faded blue eyes grew misty. "We lost touch for a while when Letitia went to work in Switzerland, but we reconnected after the war. I was in rather difficult circumstances then, and Letitia was so generous." "Switzerland?" Miss Marple's knitting needles paused momentarily. "Mrs. Blacklock never mentioned that to me. Was she a governess?" "Oh, no, nothing like that. She was a financial secretary to a banker named Godler. Quite an important position for a woman in those days." Miss Bunner sipped her tea. "That's where her money came from, you know. Mr. Godler left her a substantial legacy when he died." "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "And her sister Charlotte, did she work in Switzerland too?" Miss Bunner's cup rattled slightly in its saucer. "Charlotte? No, poor Charlotte never left England. She was delicate. Her health was always fragile. She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "When you mentioned Charlotte earlier, I was quite taken aback. Letitia rarely spoke of her, especially to new acquaintances." "Mrs. Blacklock showed me an old photograph," Miss Marple explained. "She mentioned a resemblance between Miss Julia and her sister. Did she indeed?" Miss Bunner looked troubled. "That's surprising. Charlotte has been dead for so long, you see. She died during the war. The First War, that is. I see." Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady rhythm. "And there were no other family members?" "None that Letitia ever mentioned. That's why it was such a surprise when Patrick and Julia appeared. Letitia received a letter about them. Their parents had apparently died, and they needed somewhere to stay. She was hesitant at first, but after meeting them—" Miss Bunner's voice trailed off. "After meeting them?" Miss Marple prompted. "She changed," Miss Bunner said simply. "It was as if she'd found something she'd been missing all her life, especially with Julia. She would watch the girl sometimes when Julia wasn't looking, with such an odd expression." Miss Marple nodded, thoughtfully. "Would you happen to have any of those old photographs? I find family resemblances so fascinating." Letitia kept an album in her desk. Miss Bunner replied, "I'm not sure if the inspector would approve, but, well, I don't see the harm in looking at old pictures." In Mrs. Blacklock's study, Miss Bunner unlocked the desk drawer and withdrew a leather-bound album. "Here we are," she said, placing it on the desk. "These go back quite a way." They leaned over the album together, turning pages of sepia-tinted memories, young women in Edwardian dress, family groups in formal poses, holiday snapshots from the 1920s. Miss Bunner pointed out Letitia in various stages of her life, a serious young woman with plain features but intelligent eyes, maturing into a capable, confident adult. "And here's Charlotte," Miss Bunner said, indicating a photograph of two young women. "This was taken just before Letitia went to Switzerland." Miss Marple studied the image carefully. Charlotte Blacklock had been a pretty girl, with delicate features and an ethereal quality that the camera had captured despite the photograph's age. There was a vulnerability in her expression, a fragility that contrasted with her sister's more determined countenance. "There is indeed a resemblance to Miss Julia," Miss Marple observed, "something about the eyes and the set of the mouth." Miss Bunner nodded. "Letitia noticed it immediately when Julia arrived. It quite unsettled her." She turned another page, then suddenly stopped. "That's odd." "What is it, dear?" "There's a photograph missing. It should be here. A picture of Charlotte with her fiancé." "Charlotte was engaged?" Miss Marple asked, her interest piqued. "Yes, to a young man named Michael Godler. He was the banker's son, Letitia's employer. It was all rather romantic. But then the war came, and Michael was killed at the Somme." Miss Bunner frowned at the empty space in the album. "Letitia treasured that photograph. I can't imagine why it would be removed." Miss Marple was about to respond when the study door opened abruptly. Patrick Simmons stood in the doorway, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded. "Those are private papers." "We were just looking at some old photographs," Miss Bunner explained, flustered by his tone. "Family memories, that's all." "They're not your family," Patrick said coldly, moving into the room and closing the album with a decisive snap. "And I doubt Inspector Craddock would approve of you rummaging through Cousin Letitia's belongings." "I hardly think looking at a photograph album constitutes rummaging, Miss Marple," said mildly. Miss Bunner was simply sharing some memories of her dear friend. Patrick's gaze shifted to Miss Marple, his eyes narrowing. "You seem extraordinarily interested in our family history, Miss Marple. May I ask why?" "Merely natural curiosity," she replied with an innocent smile. "When one reaches my age, the past often seems more vivid than the present, and family connections can be so fascinating. Well, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave the study now," Patrick said firmly. "Julia isn't feeling well, and all this coming and going is disturbing her." As if to confirm his words, a door closed somewhere upstairs, followed by footsteps moving across the ceiling above them. "Of course," Miss Marple said, rising to her feet. "We didn't mean to intrude. I should be getting home in any case. I promised my nephew Raymond I would telephone him this afternoon." Miss Bunner replaced the album in the desk drawer, her hands trembling slightly under Patrick's watchful gaze. As they left the study, Miss Marple paused in the hallway. "I seem to have left my knitting bag in the sitting room," she said. "Do go ahead, Dora dear. I'll just fetch it and be on my way." But instead of returning to the sitting room, Miss Marple waited until Miss Bunner had disappeared toward the kitchen, then quietly made her way back to the study door. It was ajar, and through the narrow opening she could see Patrick Simmons, standing at the desk, the photograph album open before him. As she watched, he removed something from between the pages, a photograph, which he studied intently before slipping it into his pocket. Miss Marple retreated silently, her mind working rapidly. She collected her knitting bag from the sitting room and made her farewells to Miss Bunner, promising to return the following day. Outside, the winter afternoon was already fading toward dusk. Miss Marple walked briskly through the village, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. She had nearly reached her cottage when she became aware of footsteps behind her, quick, purposeful steps on the frosty path. Miss Marple. "A moment, please." She turned to find Dr. Simmons hurrying to catch up with her, his medical bag in hand. "Dr. Simmons," she greeted him. "You're out on your rounds, I see." "Yes, though I've just been to Little Paddock's." Julia Simmons complained of a migraine. He fell into step beside her. "I understand you spent the afternoon with Miss Bunner." "Such a devoted friend to Mrs. Blacklock," Miss Marple commented, though perhaps not as informed about certain matters as she believes herself to be. Dr. Simmons glanced at her sharply. "What do you mean by that?" "Oh, merely that long-standing friendships can sometimes blind us to changes in those we think we know well." Miss Marple smiled. "Were you acquainted with Mrs. Blacklock for long, Doctor?" "Only since I took over the practice 6 months ago," he replied. "Though she consulted me frequently, she was meticulous about her health, even before the cancer diagnosis." They had reached Miss Marple's garden gate. She paused, her head tilted thoughtfully. "Dr. Simons, did Mrs. Blacklock ever mention to you a condition called Raynaud's disease?" The doctor looked surprised. "No, she never mentioned it. It's a circulatory disorder that affects blood flow to the extremities, particularly in cold weather." "Why do you ask?" "Just something I observed in an old photograph," Miss Marple said vaguely. "Well, thank you for walking with me, Doctor. I do hope Miss Julia's migraine improves." As she watched him continue down the lane, Miss Marple's gentle demeanour gave way to an expression of keen concentration. The afternoon had provided several vital pieces to her puzzle: the connection to Switzerland, the missing photograph, and Patrick's secretive behaviour. Most importantly, she now understood the significance of the name Charlotte and why it had provoked such a reaction. What she needed now was confirmation of her theory, and for that she would need to speak with Inspector Craddock about making some inquiries, both in London and in Switzerland. But first, there was one more piece of evidence to examine. Miss Marple glanced at her watch. If she hurried, she might just catch the vicar before his evening service. After all, parish records could reveal so much about a family's history, including details about births, marriages, and perhaps most significantly in this case, deaths. Chapter 7. Parish Records. The vicarage of St. Mary Mead stood adjacent to the church, a modest Georgian building with ivy climbing its weathered brick walls. As Miss Marple made her way up the gravel path, the church clock struck 5, and lights were beginning to appear in cottage windows across the village. The Reverend Julian Harmon greeted her with mild surprise. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting visitors before the evening service. Do come in." "Thank you, Vicar. I hope I'm not disturbing you, but there's a small matter about which I'd like your assistance." Mrs. Harmon, Bunch, as everyone called her, appeared from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands. "Jane, how lovely! Will you stay for tea? I've just made scones." "How kind, but I'm afraid I haven't time," Miss Marple replied. "I've come on rather urgent business concerning the parish records." The vicar raised his eyebrows. "Parish records? Are you researching your family history?" "Not mine," Miss Marple said carefully. "I'm interested in the Blacklock family. Given recent events, Inspector Craddock is trying to establish certain facts, and I thought I might be of assistance." This wasn't entirely true. She had not yet spoken to Inspector Craddock about her suspicions, but Miss Marple had found over the years that mentioning the police often facilitated access to information that might otherwise be withheld. Of course, Reverend Harmon said, leading the way to his study. "Such a terrible business at Little Paddocks. Mrs. Harmon and I were just saying how shocked we were about poor Mrs. Blacklock." "The whole village is talking of nothing else," Bunch added, following them. "Is it true that her will was changed to favour those Simmons cousins?" "Bunch," her husband chided gently, "we shouldn't gossip about such matters." "It's hardly gossip when there's been a murder, Julian," his wife retorted. "Besides, Jane isn't here for idle chat, are you?" "Indeed not," Miss Marple confirmed. "I'm particularly interested in records relating to Charlotte Blacklock. She would have died during or shortly after the First World War." The vicar nodded, thoughtfully. "The parish records from that period are quite complete. One moment." He disappeared into an adjoining room that served as the parish office, returning moments later with a large leather-bound volume. "This should cover the period you're interested in," he said, placing it on his desk. "Deaths from 1914 to 1925. Marple bent over the book, her eyes scanning the neat entries in faded ink. "Ah, here we are," she said at last. "Charlotte Ann Blacklock, died February 17th, 1918, aged 26. Poor young woman," Mrs. Harmon murmured. "Was she a relative of Mrs. Blacklock's?" "Her sister," Miss Marple replied, still studying the entry. "Vicar, does it specify the cause of death?" Reverend Harmon leaned over to examine the record. "Influenza. it seems. That would have been during the great pandemic. So many young people lost. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. And is there a record of where she was buried? The churchyard here, I should think. Most villagers were. The vicar flipped through additional pages. Yes, plot 37B in the east section. There's one more thing, Miss Marple said hesitantly. I don't suppose there would be any record of a marriage for Charlotte Blacklock, or perhaps a record of banns being read. The vicar looked surprised but turned to another volume. Let me check the marriage registers for that period. No Charlotte Blacklock listed here. The banns book might show something if the marriage was planned but never took place. After a few minutes of searching, he shook his head. I'm afraid not. If she was engaged, as you seem to suggest, the marriage was either planned for another parish or perhaps never reached the stage of having banns published. I see, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. That's most helpful, thank you. As she rose to leave, Bunch Harmon asked curiously, Why the interest in Charlotte Blacklock after all these years? Surely she can't have anything to do with Mrs. Blacklock's murder. Sometimes, to understand the present, we must examine the past, Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. The most illuminating clues can be buried in family histories. Outside, the winter evening had fully descended, street lamps casting pools of light along the high street. Miss Marple walked briskly, her mind working on the new information. The parish records had confirmed Charlotte's death in 1918, but there was still the question of her engagement to Michael Girdler, the banker's son, and how that might connect to Mrs. Blacklock's time in Switzerland, and perhaps most importantly, to Patrick and Julia Simmons. She was so deep in thought that she nearly collided with Dr. Haydock, who was emerging from the chemist's shop. Jane, do watch where you're going, he chided good-naturedly. You'll catch your death in this cold if you're not careful. I'm perfectly warm, thank you, Doctor, she replied. How fortunate to run into you. I was hoping to ask your professional opinion on something. As long as it's not your rheumatism again, he said with a twinkle in his eye. I've told you a dozen times that knitting in draughty windows doesn't help. Nothing to do with my health, Miss Marple assured him. I was wondering about Raynaud's disease. Is it hereditary by any chance? Dr. Haydock looked surprised. It can have a hereditary component, yes. It's more common in women, and often runs in families. Why do you ask? Just something I observed in an old photograph, Miss Marple said vaguely. The young woman's hands showed a distinctive whiteness that reminded me of something I once read about the condition. Yes, that could be consistent with Raynaud's. The blood vessels constrict in response to cold or stress, causing the fingers to turn white or blue. Dr. Haydock studied her curiously. This wouldn't happen to be related to the Blacklock case, would it? In a way, Miss Marple admitted. Charlotte Blacklock apparently suffered from poor health. I was wondering if Raynaud's might have been part of her condition. It's possible, though Raynaud's itself isn't life-threatening. The Spanish flu, however— Dr. Haydock shook his head. A terrible business. Took the young and healthy as often as the vulnerable. I lost my own sister to it. Yes, it was a dreadful time, Miss Marple agreed. One more question, if I may. In your experience, would a doctor routinely check a patient's hands during an examination? Certainly, Dr. Haydock confirmed. The hands can reveal a great deal about a person's health, circulation, nervous condition, even signs of certain occupations or habits. Thank you, Doctor. That's most enlightening. Miss Marple smiled. I won't keep you any longer in this cold. Good evening. Good evening, Jane. Do be careful, and I don't just mean of the weather. If you're poking around in matters related to that murder, remember that killers rarely appreciate being investigated. Miss Marple nodded acknowledgement of his warning, but her expression remained determined as she continued on her way. At her cottage, she found a note had been pushed through her letterbox. It was from Inspector Craddock, requesting that she telephone him at her earliest convenience. In her small sitting room, Miss Marple dialed the police station, her call being put through to the inspector almost immediately. Ah, Miss Marple, Craddock's voice came through clearly. I was hoping to speak with you. We've had some interesting developments. The laboratory has confirmed that the poison was indeed aconite, and more significantly, we've found a small patch of monkshood growing in a secluded corner of Mrs. Blacklock's garden. How interesting, Miss Marple murmured. Recently harvested by any chance? Exactly so. Some of the roots had been freshly dug up. But here's the curious thing. According to Miss Bunner, neither she nor Mrs. Blacklock planted it. It appears to have been a recent addition to the garden. That is significant, Miss Marple agreed. Inspector, I've been making some inquiries of my own that may be relevant. I believe the key to this case lies in Switzerland around 1918. Switzerland? There was a pause. That's rather specific, Miss Marple. May I ask what led you to that conclusion? A photograph, a missing photograph, and a curious reaction to the name Charlotte, she replied. I'd prefer not to say more until I'm certain, but I believe if you were to make inquiries about the Gödler banking family, particularly their son Michael, and any connection to the Blacklock sisters, it might prove most illuminating. There was a longer pause. I see, the inspector said finally. As it happens, I've already started looking into the Simmons siblings' background. There are some discrepancies that need explaining. I thought there might be, Miss Marple said softly. Inspector, I also think it would be wise to have someone keep a close eye on Miss Bunner. She may be in danger, whether she realizes it or not. Because of what she knows? Craddock asked sharply. Because of what she might remember, Miss Marple corrected. Sometimes the most innocent recollection can be damning to those with secrets to protect. As she replaced the receiver, Miss Marple moved to her writing desk and took out a sheet of paper. There was one more line of inquiry to pursue. A letter to her nephew Raymond's wife Joan, who had connections in the banking world and might be able to unearth information about the Gödler family more quickly than official police channels. Third, pieces were falling into place, but Miss Marple knew that time might be running short. If her theory was correct, the poisoned plum pudding had been merely the first act in a carefully orchestrated plan, and the killer would not hesitate to strike again if their secret was threatened. Chapter 8. A Second Tragedy. The morning dawned with a thick, swirling mist that clung to the cottages of St. Mary Mead like a shroud. Miss Marple woke early, her night's sleep having been disturbed by the persistent worries that often accompany a partially solved puzzle. She had just finished her breakfast when the telephone rang. Miss Marple! Inspector Craddock's voice sounded tense. I'm afraid there's been another incident at Little Paddocks. Miss Bunner has been found unconscious in her room. It appears to be an overdose of sleeping tablets. Miss Marple's hand tightened on the receiver. "Is she?" "She's alive, but in critical condition. Dr. Haydock is with her now, and an ambulance is on its way. I wonder if you might come to Little Paddocks. You seemed to have established a rapport with Miss Bunner, and your insights have been valuable." "Of course, Inspector. I'll come at once." 15 minutes later, Miss Marple arrived at Little Paddocks to find the house once again in turmoil. An ambulance stood in the driveway, its rear doors open as 2 attendants emerged with a stretcher. Through the hallway windows she could see Miss Bunner's small, frail form being carried out, an oxygen mask over her face, and Dr. Haydock walking alongside. Inspector Craddock met Miss Marple at the door. "She's being taken to the county hospital," he said without preamble. "Dr. Haydock managed to stabilize her, but it was a close call. If Julia Simmons hadn't found her when she did—" "Julia found her?" Miss Marple asked sharply. "Yes, she went to check on Miss Bunner when she didn't come down to breakfast. According to Miss Simmons, she found the door unlocked, Miss Bunner unconscious, and an empty bottle of sleeping tablets on the bedside table." They moved into the drawing room, where Patrick and Julia Simmons sat in strained silence. Julia looked pale but composed, while Patrick was visibly agitated, pacing back and forth before the fireplace. "Miss Marple," Julia acknowledged with a nod. "I suppose the inspectors told you what happened?" "Yes, my dear. How distressing for you to have found her in such a state." "It was awful," Julia admitted. "At first I thought she was just sleeping, but then I saw the empty bottle. I still don't understand how this could happen," Patrick interjected. "Dora wasn't the type to attempt suicide. She was upset about Cousin Letitia, of course, but she seemed to be coping." "The bottle was prescribed to Mrs. Blacklock, not Miss Bunner," Inspector Craddock said. "It was kept in the medicine cabinet in Mrs. Blacklock's bathroom." "So someone moved it to Miss Bunner's room?" Miss Marple asked. "Possibly. Or Miss Bunner may have taken it herself, I suppose." The inspector's tone made it clear which theory he favoured. "When did you last see Miss Bunner, Miss Simmons?" Miss Marple inquired. "Last night at dinner. She retired early, around 9, I think. She said she had a headache." Julia glanced at her brother. "Patrick and I stayed up talking for a while, then went to bed ourselves." "I see." Miss Marple's eyes moved thoughtfully around the room. "And was anything unusual about Miss Bunner's manner yesterday? Did she seem particularly upset or perhaps excited about something?" Patrick and Julia exchanged a quick glance before Julia answered. "Not that I noticed, though she did spend most of the afternoon in Mrs. Blacklock's study after you left, Miss Marple. She said she was looking for something. A particular book, I think." "Did she find it?" Miss Marple asked. "I don't know," Julia replied with a slight frown, "but she seemed rather preoccupied at dinner." Miss Marple turned to the inspector. "I wonder, might we see Miss Bunner's room?" Upstairs, Miss Bunner's bedroom presented a stark contrast to the elegant simplicity of the rest of Little Paddocks. Here, a lifetime of treasured possessions had been crammed into a modest space. Faded photographs in silver frames, delicate porcelain figurines, and books stacked on every available surface. The single bed was rumpled where Miss Bunner had been lifted onto the stretcher, and on the bedside table stood a glass of water and the empty pill bottle. "Nothing appears to have been disturbed," Inspector Craddock observed. "The bottle was found here, and the glass was half empty." Miss Marple moved slowly around the room, her eyes taking in every detail. She paused at the dressing table, where a leather-bound book lay open. "A diary?" she inquired. "Yes," the inspector confirmed. Miss Bunner apparently kept a daily journal. "This entry is from yesterday." Miss Marple leaned closer to examine the neat, somewhat spidery handwriting. "December 18th. Still cannot believe dear Elle is gone. The house feels so empty without her. Miss M visited today, and we looked at old photographs. Speaking of Charlotte made me think again about that business in Switzerland. Could it be possible? After all these years, must look at Elle's papers again to be sure." "Most interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Inspector, did you examine the contents of Mrs. Blacklock's desk after Miss Bunner mentioned searching there yesterday?" "One of my constables did a preliminary check. Nothing seemed to be missing or disturbed." The inspector's keen eyes studied Miss Marple. "You think Miss Bunner found something significant?" "It's possible," Miss Marple said carefully. "She mentioned that business in Switzerland in her diary, and given her condition this morning, you think this wasn't a suicide attempt at all," Craddock concluded. "Let us say I find the timing remarkably convenient," Miss Marple replied, "especially given our conversation yesterday about Miss Bunner potentially being in danger." A constable appeared in the doorway. "Inspector, there's a telephone call for you. Scotland Yard, sir." While the inspector was gone, Miss Marple continued her examination of the room. On the floor beside the bed, partially concealed by the trailing edge of the bedspread, was a small piece of paper. Miss Marple carefully retrieved it. A torn corner of notepaper with a single word written in what appeared to be Miss Bunner's handwriting: "Gödler." She slipped it into her handbag just as Inspector Craddock returned, his expression grim but satisfied. "That was Sergeant Ellis from Scotland Yard," he said. "We've had a response to our inquiries about Patrick and Julia Simmons. It seems there's no record of them ever having lived at the London address they claimed was their parents' home. Furthermore, the death certificate they mentioned for their father doesn't exist, at least not for anyone of that name." "How very curious," Miss Marple commented, though she did not appear particularly surprised. "Have you confronted them with this information?" "Not yet. I wanted to complete the search of Miss Bunner's room first." The inspector glanced around. "Did you notice anything else while I was gone?" "Nothing of significance," Miss Marple replied, her hand unconsciously touching her handbag. "Though I do think it would be wise to examine Mrs. Blacklock's papers more thoroughly. If Miss Bunner found something important there, it might explain this morning's tragedy." They returned downstairs to find Patrick Simmons alone in the drawing-room, standing by the window with an anxious expression. "Julia's gone to lie down," he explained. "She was quite shaken by finding Miss Bunner." "Understandable," Inspector Craddock said. "Mr. Simmons, I need to ask you and your sister some additional questions about your background. There seem to be some discrepancies in the information you provided." Patrick's face tightened. "What sort of discrepancies?" "For one thing, there's no record of your parents at the London address you gave. For another, we can find no death certificate for your father." A tense silence followed this statement. Patrick's gaze shifted between the inspector and Miss Marple, calculation evident in his expression. "I think," he said finally, "that you should speak to Julia about this. It was her idea to—" He stopped abruptly as the telephone rang in the hall. A constable answered it, then appeared in the doorway. "It's the hospital, sir, about Miss Bunner." Inspector Craddock took the call, his face sombre as he listened. When he returned to the drawing-room, his expression confirmed the news. Before he spoke, "I'm afraid Miss Bunner passed away a few minutes ago," he announced. "She never regained consciousness." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, her lined face reflecting genuine sorrow. "Poor Dora," she murmured. "This changes matters significantly," the inspector continued, his gaze hardening as he turned to Patrick. "We're no longer investigating an attempted suicide, Mr. Simmons, but what appears to be a second murder. I think it's time you and your sister told us exactly who you are and what your relationship was to Mrs. Blacklock." Patrick seemed to deflate slightly, the confident facade crumbling. "I'll get Julia," he said quietly. "You're right. There are things you need to know. But it's not what you think. We didn't kill Cousin Letitia or Dora." As he left the room, Inspector Craddock turned to Miss Marple. "You don't seem surprised by any of this," he observed. "No," she admitted. "I've had my suspicions for some time, though I wasn't entirely certain until now. The missing photograph, you see, and Charlotte's engagement to Michael Godler. It all points to a very specific conclusion." "Which is?" Miss Marple opened her handbag and withdrew the torn piece of paper she had found. "I believe the answer lies in Switzerland, just as I suggested yesterday, and I think Miss Bunner died because she remembered something crucial about the Godler family, something that threatened our murderer's carefully constructed plan." The sound of footsteps in the hall announced Patrick's return with his sister. Julia entered the room with her head held high, though her face was pale and strained. She looked first at Miss Marple, then at the inspector, and finally at the small piece of paper in Miss Marple's hand. "I see," she said quietly. "You know, don't you?" "I believe so," Miss Marple replied. "It's about Charlotte Blacklock's child, isn't it? The child she had with Michael Godler." Chapter 9. The truth emerges. The silence that followed Miss Marple's statement seemed to stretch endlessly. Julia Simmons stood perfectly still, her face a careful mask, though her hands betrayed her tension as they gripped the back of a chair. "How did you know?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Various small things," Miss Marple replied gently. "The missing photograph of Charlotte with Michael Godler, Mrs. Blacklock's comment about your resemblance to her sister, the fact that you and Patrick don't behave quite like siblings, and then there was Miss Bunner's diary entry about that business in Switzerland. It all pointed to a secret from the past, a secret valuable enough to kill for." Inspector Craddock looked from Miss Marple to Julia with growing comprehension. "Are you suggesting that Miss Simmons is actually—" "I am Charlotte Blacklock's granddaughter," Julia interrupted, her composure finally breaking. "And Patrick isn't my brother. He's my husband." Patrick moved to stand beside her, placing a protective arm around her shoulders. "We didn't kill Cousin Letitia or Miss Bunner," he said firmly. "Whatever you may think of our deception, we're not murderers. Perhaps you'd better explain from the beginning," Inspector Craddock suggested, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp with suspicion. Julia sank into a chair, while Patrick remained standing behind her, his hand still on her shoulder in a gesture of support. Charlotte Blacklock and Michael Godler were engaged to be married when the First World War began. Julia began. Michael was killed at the Somme in 1916, but before he left for France, he and Charlotte— She hesitated. They anticipated their marriage, Miss Marple supplied delicately. Yes. Charlotte discovered she was expecting a child shortly after receiving news of Michael's death. In those days, for a respectable young woman to bear a child out of wedlock was unthinkable. Charlotte's father, a strict, unforgiving man by all accounts, would have disowned her completely. So what happened? Inspector Craddock prompted. Letitia took charge of the situation. Patrick continued the story. She arranged for Charlotte to go to Switzerland, ostensibly to recover from the shock of Michael's death at a private sanitarium. In reality, she went to have the baby in secret. Randolph Godler, Michael's father, knew the truth and helped financially. He felt responsible for his son's child. The baby was a girl, Julia said softly. My mother, Emma. She was adopted by a Swiss couple named Müller, but the Godlers maintained a connection with her throughout her childhood. When she was 18, they told her the truth about her parentage. And by then, Charlotte had died in the influenza epidemic, Miss Marple noted. Yes. Charlotte never saw her daughter again after giving her up. According to my mother, it broke her heart. Julia's voice held a hint of bitterness. Letitia returned to England and eventually became Randolph Godler's secretary. When he died, he left her a substantial legacy. Money that might have gone to Charlotte's child if the truth had been known. So you came to claim your inheritance, Inspector Craddock asked bluntly. Not initially, Patrick replied. Julia's mother died last year, and among her papers we found letters from Randolph Godler to the Millers, along with photographs of Charlotte and Letitia. Julia wanted to know more about her English family. We wrote to Letitia, Julia continued. We didn't reveal everything at first, just that I was researching my family history and believed we might be related through the Godlers. She invited us to visit, and when we met, her voice faltered. She saw Charlotte in you, Miss Marple said with understanding. Yes. The resemblance apparently startled her. We told her the truth then, and she was overwhelmed. She asked us to stay, to give her time to adjust to the idea. She suggested we pretend to be siblings, distant cousins of hers, while she decided what to do. And then she changed her will in your favour, Inspector Craddock observed. She said it was only right, Patrick explained, that the Godler money should go to Charlotte's descendants. She was planning to tell everyone the truth after Christmas. A very convenient arrangement for you, the inspector commented dryly. We didn't need to kill her for the inheritance, Julia exclaimed. She had already changed her will, and she was dying anyway. Dr. Simons confirmed that. Yes, but perhaps you were concerned she might change her mind, Inspector Craddock suggested, or that someone else might challenge the will if the truth about your identity came out in a less controlled manner. That's absurd, Patrick protested. We had nothing to do with her death, or Miss Bunner's. Miss Marple, who had been watching the exchange thoughtfully, spoke up. Miss Bunner's diary mentioned looking through Mrs. Blacklock's papers. What did you think she was searching for? I don't know, Julia said, frowning. Perhaps letters from the Godlers. Letitia kept a correspondence file in her desk. And did Miss Bunner know about your true identity? Miss Marple pressed. No, Patrick said decisively. Letitia insisted on keeping it secret from everyone, especially Dora. She said Dora was too emotional, too easily upset by change. She planned to tell her after Christmas as well. But Miss Bunner might have found something in those papers that led her to suspect the truth, Inspector Craddock mused, which could explain why she was silenced. Not by us, Julia insisted, her eyes filling with tears. Why would we harm her? She was no threat to us. Miss Marple studied the couple thoughtfully. Tell me, when did Mrs. Blacklock first show signs of illness? The question seemed to catch both Patrick and Julia off guard. They exchanged a quick glance before Patrick answered. About 2 months ago, I think. She mentioned feeling unwell at dinner one evening. Shortly after your arrival, then, Miss Marple noted. That's just coincidence, Julia said defensively. You can't possibly think we— I'm merely establishing a timeline, Miss Marple said mildly. Inspector, I wonder if Dr. Simmons might join us. I believe he may be able to provide some additional insights. While a constable was dispatched to fetch the doctor, an uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Julia dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Patrick paced restlessly by the window. Miss Marple appeared lost in thought, her fingers moving, as if knitting invisible stitches. Dr. Simons arrived looking harried, his medical bag still in hand. I was about to head to the hospital, he explained. There's been a development in Miss Bunner's case. The preliminary toxicology report shows unusually high levels of digitalis in her system, in addition to the sleeping tablets. Digitalis, Inspector Craddock repeated sharply. That wasn't mentioned earlier. It wasn't immediately apparent, Dr. Simons explained. The symptoms of digitalis poisoning can be masked by other conditions. Miss Bunner had a heart condition for which she took medication, but the levels in her system were far beyond therapeutic dosage. Foxglove, Miss Marple murmured. It grows wild in the woods beyond the village, and it's also cultivated in gardens for its attractive flowers. Exactly, Dr. Simons agreed. Digitalis is derived from foxglove. A concentrated extract could easily be added to food or drink, or to a cup of tea, perhaps, Miss Marple suggested. Quite possibly, the doctor confirmed. Inspector Craddock turned to Patrick and Julia. Did either of you prepare tea for Miss Bunner yesterday evening? I did, Julia admitted. But so did Patrick, and Dr. Simmons visited her as well. In fact, everyone in the house had the opportunity to give her something. That's true, Dr. Simons acknowledged. I checked on her around 7 o'clock. She seemed agitated, said she needed to speak with the inspector about something important she'd remembered. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Did she say what it was about? No, just that it concerned Switzerland and the Godlers. Dr. Simmons glanced at Patrick and Julia. I assumed it had something to do with Mrs. Blacklock's time working for the banking family. And did you report this to Inspector Craddock? Miss Marple inquired. The young doctor shifted uncomfortably. I intended to, but by the time I returned to the village, it was quite late. I planned to telephone this morning. I see, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. And when did Mrs. Blacklock first consult you about the symptoms that led to her cancer diagnosis? Dr. Simons appeared surprised by the change of subject. About 2 months ago. She complained of unexplained weight loss, persistent nausea, and abdominal pain. All symptoms that could also be consistent with low-level arsenic poisoning, are they not? Miss Marple asked quietly. A stunned silence followed this question. Dr. Simons's face drained of colour, while Inspector Craddock looked sharply at Miss Marple. "That's a very serious implication, Miss Marple," he said. "Indeed it is, Inspector. But considering we now have 2 deaths connected to the Blacklock household, I think it warrants investigation." She turned her clear gaze to Dr. Simons. "Perhaps you could explain your interest in the Godler banking family, Doctor, and why you removed the photograph of Charlotte and Michael from Mrs. Blacklock's album. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, unexpected and suffocating." Dr. Simons stood frozen, his expression shifting from shock to calculation to something darker. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I think you do," Miss Marple persisted gently. "I think you recognized the Blacklock name when you took over the practice. And I think when Mrs. Blacklock showed you her family photographs during a house call, you saw something, or rather, someone, you recognized from your own family history." Patrick had moved closer to Julia, his posture tense and protective. Inspector Craddock's hand had shifted subtly toward his coat pocket, where his service revolver was undoubtedly concealed. "Dr. Simons?" Miss Marple continued in the same gentle tone. "Or should I say, Dr. Godler, that is your mother's family name, isn't it?" Chapter 10. Dr. Simons's Secret. For a moment Dr. Simons stood perfectly still, his face a study in conflicting emotions. Then, with a deliberate movement that startled everyone, he placed his medical bag on a nearby table and sank into an armchair. "Dolph, long have you known?" he asked Miss Marple, his voice hollow. I began to suspect when Mrs. Blacklock mentioned that you had taken a particular interest in her family photographs." Miss Marple replied. "But it was Miss Bunner's diary entry about Switzerland that confirmed my suspicions." Inspector Craddock stepped forward. "Perhaps you should explain yourself, Doctor." Dr. Simons passed a hand over his face, suddenly looking much older than his 30-odd years. "My mother was Elise Godler, Randolph Godler's niece. My grandfather was his brother, Werner Godler, who managed the family's Swiss banking interests. And you knew about Charlotte Blacklock's child?" the inspector pressed. "It was a family secret, rarely discussed, but never entirely forgotten." Dr. Simons glanced at Julia. "When I took over the practice here and saw the name Blacklock on the patient list, I was curious. My mother had mentioned that Randolph's former secretary lived in this area. So you deliberately sought out Mrs. Blacklock?" Miss Marple asked. "Not precisely. She came for a routine checkup shortly after I arrived, and I recognized the name. I made a point of getting to know her, and eventually she invited me to tea and showed me her family photographs." His eyes flickered toward Julia again. "When I saw the picture of Charlotte with my great-uncle Michael, I was intrigued." "Intrigued enough to steal the photograph?" Inspector Craddock suggested. Dr. Simons flushed. "I didn't steal it. I borrowed it to compare with family photographs in my possession. I intended to return it." "And did you also borrow some monkshood from the woods to plant in Mrs. Blacklock's garden?" the inspector inquired dryly. "What? No!" Dr. Simons looked genuinely shocked. "I had nothing to do with that, or with the poisoning." Patrick, who had been watching, the doctor intently spoke up. "But you knew about Julia and me, didn't you? You realized who she was when we arrived?" Dr. Simons nodded reluctantly. "I suspected. The resemblance to the photograph of Charlotte was remarkable, and when Mrs. Blacklock began treating you with such obvious favouritism, changing her will so quickly, I was certain. Were you concerned about your own inheritance? Miss Marple asked gently. As a Girdler, did you feel the family money should remain within the family? There was no inheritance for me, Dr. Simmons said bitterly. The English branch of the family lost most of their fortune in the crash of '29. What remained went to Randolph's chosen heirs, Mrs. Blacklock, and a few distant cousins. My branch of the family received nothing. A powerful motive for resentment, Inspector Craddock observed. I didn't kill her, Dr. Simons insisted, rising halfway from his chair before sinking back. Yes, I was curious about the connection. Yes, I was even a bit resentful when I discovered she'd changed her will to favour complete strangers. Hardly strangers? Julia interrupted. I'm Charlotte's granddaughter. The money came from my grandfather, Michael Girdler, who was never legally married to your grandmother, Dr. Simmons retorted. In the eyes of the law, you have no claim to the Girdler fortune. But in Mrs. Blacklock's eyes, she did, Miss Marple pointed out. And that's what matters, isn't it? Mrs. Blacklock decided that Charlotte's descendant should inherit what would have been Charlotte's share of the Girdler money. It wasn't fair, Dr. Simons muttered. My mother struggled all her life, while Mrs. Blacklock lived comfortably on Girdler money. So you decided to take matters into your own hands, Inspector Craddock said. Started poisoning Mrs. Blacklock with small doses of arsenic to mimic the symptoms of cancer, which you then diagnosed yourself. That's preposterous, Dr. Simons exclaimed. I sent her to a specialist in London. He confirmed the diagnosis. Did he? Miss Marple asked. Or did you merely tell Mrs. Blacklock that he had? A frightened patient often takes their doctor's word without question. A tense silence followed this suggestion. Dr. Simmons opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again, his expression calculating. You can't prove any of this, he said finally. Perhaps not without an exhumation and toxicology. Tests, Inspector Craddock agreed. But Miss Bunner's death is another matter. You visited her yesterday evening by your own admission. You had the opportunity to add digitalis to her tea or medication. And you had access to her sleeping tablets, Miss Marple added. As Mrs. Blacklock's doctor, you knew exactly what had been prescribed and where it was kept. Dr. Simmons's composure began to crack. This is absurd. Why would I kill Miss Bunner? Because she remembered something, Miss Marple said softly. Something about the Girdler family that threatened you. Perhaps she recalled that there had been a scandal involving Werner Girdler, your grandfather, and the bank's funds. The doctor's face went white. How could you possibly know about that? I didn't, Miss Marple admitted, but your reaction confirms it. Werner Girdler embezzled from the family bank, didn't he? That's why his branch of the family was disinherited, and somehow Miss Bunner knew, or at least she remembered enough to make the connection when she went through Mrs. Blacklock's papers yesterday. Patrick looked bewildered. But what has this to do with Letitia's murder? Miss Marple turned to him with a gentle smile. Everything, I'm afraid. You see, Dr. Simons didn't just want to prevent Mrs. Blacklock from leaving her money to Julia. He wanted to ensure that the true circumstances of the Girdler disinheritance never came to light. When Miss Bunner mentioned looking into that business in Switzerland, He feared she had found letters or documents referring to his grandfather's disgrace. But how would Miss Bunner know to look for such information? Julia asked. She probably didn't, not specifically, Miss Marple explained. But after our conversation about Charlotte, she was reminded of the Swiss connection. She may have been simply looking for information about Charlotte's time there. But in doing so, she stumbled across something damaging to the Gödler name. "And the poisoned pudding?" Inspector Craddock prompted. "Opportunity and misdirection," Miss Marple said. Dr. Simons had been poisoning Mrs. Blacklock slowly, but he realized that her condition would eventually require a second opinion. If another doctor discovered it wasn't cancer at all, suspicion would naturally fall on her physician. He needed a different method and a different suspect. The plum pudding provided both, Inspector Craddock concluded, and with Patrick and Julia standing to inherit, they would be the obvious suspects. "I never touched that pudding," Dr. Simons protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Didn't you?" Miss Marple asked. "I think you arrived early for dinner that evening. Perhaps you offered to help Miss Bunner in the kitchen while she was distracted. Or perhaps you simply visited during the day, knowing she was preparing the pudding, and added the aconite then." "You can't prove any of this, Doctor," Simons repeated, but sweat had begun to bead on his forehead. "That's where you're wrong, Doctor," Inspector Craddock said. "We've already examined the garden shed at your cottage. We found traces of both monkshood and foxglove, along with equipment for extracting and concentrating plant toxins. This was a bluff." Miss Marple could tell by the slight emphasis the inspector placed on his words, but it had the desired effect. Dr. Simons seemed to collapse in on himself, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "It was supposed to be quick and painless," he said, his voice barely audible. "She was dying anyway. I just hastened the inevitable. And the old woman, she knew too much. She found letters from my grandfather to Randolph, begging for forgiveness. If that scandal resurfaced, my practice would be ruined. The Gödler name would be dragged through the mud all over again." As Inspector Craddock formally cautioned and then arrested Dr. Simons, Miss Marple watched with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Another case solved, another murderer brought to justice. Yet the waste of lives and the tangle of human emotions that led to such desperate acts never ceased to sadden her. Julia sank onto the sofa, her face pale. "I still can't believe it," she murmured. "All this time we suspected everyone but him." "That's often the way," Miss Marple said sympathetically. "The person we trust with our health seems above suspicion, yet doctors are human too, with the same frailties and temptations as the rest of us." "What happens now?" Patrick asked, sitting beside his wife and taking her hand. "That will be for the courts to decide," Inspector Craddock replied, as two constables led Dr. Simons away. "But as for you two, I suggest you be more forthcoming about your true identities in the future. Deception, even for understandable reasons, tends to create more problems than it solves." As the inspector followed his prisoner outside, Miss Marple prepared to take her leave. The case was solved, but there was still one loose end to address. Mrs. Simons, she corrected herself with a smile. "I wonder if I might make a suggestion." "Of course, Miss Marple," Julia replied. "After all you've done." "It's about Miss Bunner," Miss Marple said softly. "She was devoted to Mrs. Blacklock all her life. When you settle your affairs here, Perhaps you might consider a small memorial. To them both. Something to remember them by in the village they called home. Julia's eyes filled with tears. That's a lovely idea. We'll certainly do that. And perhaps, Miss Marple added, you might also find a place in your home for that photograph of your grandmother Charlotte with Michael Godler once the police return it. Family connections, you know, are so important to preserve. As Miss Marple walked home through the winter twilight, she reflected on the tangled web of past secrets and present crimes that had led to such tragedy. The truth had emerged at last, but at a terrible cost. Yet there was some consolation in knowing that Charlotte Blacklock's granddaughter would now take her rightful place in the family story, a story that had waited more than 3 decades to reach its proper conclusion. Chapter 11. The Circle. Close's spring had come to St. Mary Mead, transforming the village with an abundance of daffodils, crocuses, and early tulips. Miss Marple worked contentedly in her garden, preparing the soil for her prized sweet peas while contemplating the subtle patterns of human behaviour that had once again revealed themselves in the tragic events of the previous winter. "Miss Marple, good morning." She looked up to see Julia Simmons, now openly Julia Simmons Parker, at her garden gate. The young woman looked different now, more at ease with herself, no longer maintaining the cool, slightly artificial poise she had affected during her time of pretence. "My dear, how nice to see you," Miss Marple greeted her, removing her gardening gloves. "Are you settled in at Little Paddocks now?" "Quite settled, thank you," Julia replied, entering the garden. "Though it still feels strange sometimes, living in a house with so many sad memories." "That will pass with time," Miss Marple assured her. "A house takes on the character of its inhabitants. A few months of happiness and Little Paddocks will feel like home." "I hope so." Julia hesitated, then added, "We've finally finished going through Cousin Letitia's papers. We found something I thought might interest you. A journal she kept during her time in Switzerland with Charlotte." She held out a small leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. Miss Marple accepted it with careful hands. "How very thoughtful of you," she said, "though perhaps this should remain with your family." "We've made a copy for ourselves," Julia explained, "but we wanted you to have this. After all, if it weren't for you—" She left the sentence unfinished, but her meaning was clear. "Most kind," Miss Marple murmured. "How is Patrick adjusting to village life?" "Remarkably well," Julia said with a smile. "He's joined the local cricket team, and he's helping to organise the summer fete. Everyone's been very welcoming, especially now that they know the truth about us. People are generally understanding when given the chance," Miss Marple observed, "though I imagine there was quite a bit of gossip at first." "Oh, yes," Julia laughed. "Mrs. Bantry has been particularly diligent in explaining our romantic circumstances to anyone who will listen. But it's all quite friendly." They moved to the small garden bench beneath a flowering cherry tree, where Miss Marple had been accustomed to take her afternoon tea in favourable weather. "Have you had any news of Dr. Simmons?" Miss Marple inquired delicately. Julia's expression sobered. "He's awaiting trial. His solicitor has apparently advised him to plead guilty to manslaughter rather than murder, claiming diminished responsibility due to family pressure and historical grievances." She shook her head. "It's hard to believe someone so seemingly normal could harbour such resentment for so long." People often carry the weight of family grievances through generations, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. I remember a similar case in the village years. Ago, the Meadows family, and the Tithertons. A dispute over land boundaries in 1887 led to a feud that culminated in a poisoning in 1923. But to kill two people over money and family pride, Julia mused, it seems so disproportionate. Murder often does, Miss Marple agreed. Yet to the murderer, it seems not just reasonable, but necessary. Dr. Simmons believed he was rectifying a historical injustice, you see. And once he had taken that first step, the slow poisoning of Mrs. Blacklock, each subsequent action seemed essential to protect himself. They sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the twisted path that had led to such tragedy. Then Julia brightened visibly. I nearly forgot the real reason I came today. We wanted to invite you to a small ceremony next Sunday. We've arranged for a memorial bench to be placed in the churchyard in memory of Cousin Letitia and Miss Bunner. How fitting, Miss Marple approved. They were such fixtures of village life. The vicar will say a few words, and then we'll have a small gathering. At Little Paddocks afterward, Julia hesitated. We also wanted to ask if you'd consider being godmother to our child, when he or she arrives in September, that is. Miss Marple's eyes widened in surprise, then crinkled with genuine pleasure. My dear, I would be honoured, though I am rather elderly for such a responsibility. Age brings wisdom, Julia said firmly, and we want our child to know the true story of their family, all of it, the good and the bad. Who better to guide them than someone who understands that the past shapes us, but doesn't have to define us? After Julia had departed, Miss Marple remained in her garden, watching the play of light through the cherry blossoms. She opened Letitia Blacklock's journal, turning the fragile pages carefully until a particular entry caught her eye. April 17, 1917. Charlotte's daughter was born today, a beautiful little girl with her father's eyes. We've named her Emma, as Charlotte wished. The Müllers came to collect her this afternoon. Charlotte wept bitterly afterward, but she knows this is for the best. Mr. Godler has arranged for the child to be well provided for, though always in secret. Sometimes I wonder if such necessary deceptions ever truly end, or if they simply create new patterns of secrecy that echo through the years. How prophetic those words had proved to be, Miss Marple reflected. The secrets of 1917 had indeed echoed through the decades, culminating in those terrible deaths last December. Yet now, with Julia's child on the way, perhaps the pattern could finally be broken. A new generation would grow up knowing their true heritage without shame or concealment. The telephone rang inside the cottage, interrupting her thoughts. It was Inspector Craddock, calling to inform her that Dr. Simmons had made a full confession, confirming every detail of her theory. Remarkable, Miss Marple, the inspector said, his voice warm with admiration. You pieced it all together from such seemingly insignificant details. A missing photograph, an old diary entry, a casual remark about Switzerland. Not insignificant at all, Inspector, she corrected gently. In human relationships, it's often the small things that reveal the most. A glance, a hesitation, a word chosen or avoided. These are the true clues to character and intention. Well, the case is closed now, thanks to you. The Crown Prosecution Service is quite satisfied. After the call ended, Miss Marple returned to her garden. The village church clock struck noon, its familiar chime carrying across the peaceful scene. Life in St. Mary Mead would continue as it always had, with its small dramas and petty rivalries, its kindnesses and its gossip. And somewhere in that tapestry of ordinary life, Miss Marple knew, the darker threads of human nature would inevitably appear again, requiring her particular talent for observation and understanding. But for now, there was the simple pleasure of spring sunshine, the promise of sweet peas to come, and the satisfaction of justice served. Miss Marple gathered her gardening tools and headed indoors to prepare lunch. On her kitchen table lay a half-finished cardigan she was knitting for Julia's expected child, a small, tangible symbol of life, continuing beyond tragedy, of new beginnings, emerging from old endings. As she measured tea leaves into her pot, Miss Marple reflected that this was perhaps the most important lesson of all, that while human nature remained constant in its capacity for both evil and good, there was always the possibility of renewal, of patterns broken and circles closed. After the bitter poison of murder and deceit, such knowledge was as comforting as a perfectly brewed cup of tea on a spring afternoon in St. Mary Mead.